big diplomatic win for India. The death sentence for Indians in the Qatar case has been commuted. Relief for former Navy officers, 8 Navy officers who were arrested in Qatar on charges of espionage. Sentence commuted days after PM Qatar Emir meet. The former Indian Navy officers won't hang. It's a big diplomatic win. Remember that the Indian administration had pressed itself into action immediately after a Qatari court had handed over the death sentence to these 8 former Indian Navy officers who were arrested in August 2022 in Qatar on charges of alleged spying. India went to court over there in appeal against the death sentence, and now what we're learning from the ground is that the death sentence has now been commuted. So that is a big diplomatic win for India. My colleague Shiv Arur is now joining me live on this from Newsroom. Shiv, the External Affairs Minister, had met with the families of these 8 former Indian Navy officers and assured them immediately of all assistance. Today, our Indian ambassador to Qatar was in court himself when, of course, the sentence was commuted.
Huge diplomatic win for India, Polomi, because this is a case that was, almost, India practically had to wash its hands off this case because of the seriousness of the details involved. Now, 8 former Indian Navy officers, including Commander Purnendu Tiwari, and we've got pictures of all of them because we were the only channel that had reported the story over a year ago in August. They had been, working for a company providing, shipping, logistics, and other services to the Qatar government. Now, these 8 Indian Navy officers, former officers, all retired, of course, in the private sector, had been arrested on charges of espionage. And espionage carries the death sentence in Qatar very much like it does in other countries in West Asia. And they were arrested, they were put under arrest. It became a huge deal, Polomi, because some of these officers, were pretty senior, including, like I said, the senior most among them, who is a Commodore, Purnendu Tiwari, which is the equivalent of a brigadier in the army. Now, the story actually took an even bigger turn when these former Indian Navy personnel received the death sentence in October this year. They were, sentenced to death by a Qatar court. They were detained in August 22nd, so they had spent over a year in jail. Then they were sentenced to death on suspicion of working as spies for Israel. So they were accused of actually spying on behalf of Israel. And as you can imagine, in the wake of what happened in what's been happening in Israel at this point of time, things took an even bigger color because of the Israel-Hamas war, the global attention being paid in that particular area. But what we had been assured for over a year now by the External Affairs Ministry, the Navy, the government of India, was that every effort was being made between India and Qatar to make sure that these men are extradited back to India or they face justice here in India or whatever it is. The diplomatic machinery needs to take care of it because it was unacceptable that 8 Indian Navy veterans face the death penalty in a country like Qatar, with which India actually has pretty close relations of every kind. So we're yet to get the details of what the death sentence has been commuted to. There's a jail term is still there on the on the sentence. We don't know what the length of that jail sentence is, Polomi, yet, but a commutation of the death sentence is a massive diplomatic win for India.
Absolutely, a massive diplomatic win for India. And the fact that you mentioned, Shiv, earlier itself, that this was a very sensitive case in itself. But the Indian government made its position very clear that, one, they're absolutely shocked by, of course, the sentence that was handed down to these former 8 Indian Navy officers. And then, of course, pressed itself into action with the External Affairs Minister taking charge. The Prime Minister also was in a sense privy to all the details, and that is why we saw our entire diplomatic mission in Qatar get into action.
Diplomatic win, there's no doubt about it. The details of what the Indian government would have probably needed to do, to convince Qatar to actually commute the sentence, leaves a lot to the imagination right now. But I can tell you that there would have been a lot of moving parts. Remember, India and Qatar have been trying to develop a relationship that goes beyond just merely trade. There's a huge Indian population that lives in Qatar, lives and works in Qatar. There is a large economic relationship as well. All of this, of course, is aside from the fact that, if laws were broken, then people who've broken laws, should face the law of the land in Qatar. But it has been India's stand right from the start that this is a mistake, that there was no question of any kind of espionage, certainly no espionage on behalf of Israel or any other country. These were private sector individuals, naval veterans working for a company that had experience providing certain services, logistics services and other services in Qatar. The nature of their work was sensitive. The nature of their work meant that they needed to interface, with classified projects, classified departments of the Qatari, military system. And therefore, it's possible that some kind of mistake had been made. Maybe they were scapegoats. Maybe there were vested interests who sort of framed these 8 officers. All of those details will perhaps come out now that the death sentence has been commuted. But what I can tell you for sure is this is 100% a diplomatic achievement, because when it comes to another country's laws, especially a country like Qatar, and Qatar is already embroiled in a big way right now with everything that's happening in Israel. Qatar is the country that provides a safe haven to Hamas leadership as well, remember. So there are many, smaller moving parts. It's going to be interesting to see how India actually achieved this. What did the Indian government, the External Affairs Ministry, actually need to do to convince Qatar to not hang these men? That's the big question here.
Absolutely. And the fact that Qatar saw reason when India did go to appeal against these death sentences that were handed down to these 8 former ex-Navy officers in the month of October, and India went to the Court of Appeal in Qatar. The fact that the Qatari court did see reason in it, that India itself is convinced. In fact, the statement that the MEA has just released announcing the sentences having been reduced, it reads, "Our ambassador to Qatar and other officials were present in the Court of Appeal today along with the family members. We have stood by them since the beginning of the matter, and we will continue to extend all consular and legal assistance. We will also continue to take up the matter with the Qatari authorities," unquote. So India says that it will continue to, of course, press with the Qatari authorities that this indeed is a mistake. The Indian administration, from the word go, has been convinced that this has been a mistake.
That's correct, and it most definitely is, in India's official view that this is a mistake, because India is a country that has demonstrated that it takes the laws of the land of its diplomatic partners very, very seriously. There are cases all over the world, where Indian citizens have been detained or arrested, where India has cooperated in all manners necessary. In this particular case, given the sensitivity, given the, given how, how sensitive the allegations against these men are, people with credible, verifiable backgrounds. Many of these are medal winners in the Navy. Many of them are senior officers who've spent decades in the Indian Navy. These are stand-up citizens of the country. And therefore, right from the start in August 2022, Polami, when these men were arrested, something seemed amiss. Dal mein kuch kala hai, as they say. So right from the start, it seemed like, there are some wheels within wheels that may be turning, some kind of pressure. Is this arrest being used as leverage for something else? All of those things remain obscure right now. We may not know exactly what happened. We may actually never know, given the nature of the allegations against these men. But what I can tell you for sure from experience in tracking diplomatic cases of this kind concerning, Indian military veterans in other countries, these are extremely sensitive. It's very difficult for a death sentence or a life sentence to be commuted in any manner. It definitely takes a very high level sort of diplomatic intervention. So hats off to the diplomatic machinery, the diplomats, the Indian embassy in Qatar that was there. The meeting between the Emir and the Prime Minister would have most certainly helped, but it is the nitty-gritties of that interface which would have finally resulted in this commutation. We're going to wait to see what that was.
Absolutely. The nitty-gritties of how the Indian mission, of course, in Qatar ensured that, there was reason that the Qatari court did see in the appeal that the Indian administration made in this case. And, of course, you mentioned the Prime Minister's meeting with the Emir of Qatar as well on the sidelines of the COP28 meeting in Dubai as well. At that time, the MEA said that they discussed the well-being of the Indian community in Qatar. It was much speculated whether this came up for conversation, but nobody could miss the fact that that meeting, in fact, came just days after India had gone into appeal.
Things obviously have moved really fast, and that's one of the first things, Paulomi, that tells you that this wasn't just a judicial process or a legal process or an appeals process. There was obviously much more than that. If the men were arrested in August 22nd, they had been in jail for over a year. In October, they were sentenced to death. Then there was appeal. You had all of these big high-level meetings that take place, and then there is this commutation. Nobody is saying that Qatar is a different kind of country. I don't want to cast any aspersions, but these are countries where where the lines dividing the political class, the political system, the judiciary, and others, are very, very blurred. There are no real clear-cut lines.